Leading us off today will be Amanda Calso, and she is the Assistant Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education in the Division of Experiential Education and the Executive Director of our Global Education Office. Following her will be Anna Hayes, who is the Director of our Office of Global Health and Safety. And then our panelists will be Amy Bowes, who's the Associate Director of the Global Education Office, Emily Durham, who's the Program Director for the Rubenstein Bing Student Athlete Civic Engagement Program, often referred to as ACE. And then finally, Susan Pratt, who is the new Program Director for Duke Immerse, formerly an Assistant Director at GEO, and right now she's kind of serving in both roles. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Amanda to introduce our division.
Thank you, Catherine, for that introduction and for stating the full name of ACE so that I don't have to in this segment of the program. As Catherine mentioned, yes, I do lead the Division of Experiential Education, which is a division that was created in fall of 2020 in the Office of Undergraduate Education. We thought it would be great to get together programming units and experts to learn and live together, so to speak, but also with the idea of using that expertise and spreading it across the undergraduate population, at the very least at Duke. So we are a set of offices, programming offices, and individuals with a shared primary focus of providing Duke students with transformative learning experiences off campus. So you can see the units and here. So ACE is a 3-week summer program based on civic engagement activities for athletes, student athletes at both Duke University and Stanford University. So we've got crossover over crossover. Duke Immerse is a semester-long cluster of courses, problem-focused, small group-oriented, with experiential components, often taking students off campus on excursions. The Global Education Office, known as GEO, is where Duke's study abroad, study away programmings live. So if you have heard of the Duke In programs, that's Duke GEO operating those programs. Duke Summer Experiences is a core project of experiential education. It's been a lot of fun pulling it together. It's actually based on programming that some of you are doing. It's an aggregate of experiential programming across campus, and it's meant to be a resource and community for model practices and best practices and assistance for Duke's experiential programmers writ large. And the newest member of our family is the Duke Office of Global Health and Safety, which was finally formed last fall, but it was really based on many years of history and experience and expertise in this realm. The thought being, what if we take that expertise and knowledge and we spread it beyond the programs listed on this slide, but make it available to the larger Duke community. And so OJHS, as we call it, was born. Before we proceed, and Anna will be the next to speak, I want to speak just a moment from my own experience. I have been working in international education for over 30 years. And I have to say, I never could have dreamed of something that would stop us in our tracks as abruptly and completely as a global pandemic. The last 3 years, getting students back into the field, convincing senior leadership that we could do it safely, putting all of the plans in action that it took in order to get students out and about and learning again was an incredible experience, one shared with many people on this panel. And I can't overestimate the amount of time and energy and anxiety that went into that. And you will hear some of our lessons learned today. I'll also say the good news is our students' adventurous spirit does not seem to be dampened They are, in fact, reaching out into the world for global learning with a vengeance. We're seeing that in numbers across our programming. So they're very interested in getting out and about, and I hope you're seeing that in your learning experiences and offerings as well. So without further ado, I will hand this over to Anna, who will tell us a little bit about OJHS and begin us with some of the experiences we've had.
Thank you, Amanda. As she said, OJHS is the kind of newest unit within experiential education, and I started as director in November of 2022. OJHS, our mission is to support and promote the health, safety, security, and preparedness of Duke programs and students in the field and assess the risk of such travel. So we really, even though we're housed in EE and we support the EE units, we really support the whole campus and can help with any program that might be taking students out in the field. We can help you with reviewing or proposing travel, navigating the myriad of Duke policies and procedures related to travel, provide risk analysis and mitigation. We do a lot of work with participation agreements and have guidance for specific travel on our website. So you can, if you have questions about kind of what we do or how we can work with you or your unit, you can reach us at ojhs@duke.edu. So Amanda already started touching on COVID, but let's talk a little bit more about kind of what happened in experiential education around COVID. So most of our programs restarted and sending students in fall of 2021. But that took a lot of effort on the part of our units. There were a myriad of new policies that took into place that were put into place related to travel in the midst of COVID. And so it was a big undertaking to restart in fall of 2021 after a complete stop. Students were required to follow Duke's vaccine policy and still are when participating in a study away program. But we also had to contend with local laws and policies because they would kind of preside over Duke and American standards. So depending on what the quarantine policies were, isolation policies were at our host locations, we had to contend with those on top of kind of what Duke's policies said. But Duke was supporting students with COVID throughout their experience. So we weren't immune to students having COVID. We would frequently have students with COVID, but we had policies and procedures in place with all of our locations based, again, on Duke's policies and the host locations, laws, and standards. But as we are coming out of COVID or moving alongside COVID, however you want to define what period we're in now, there are a number of trending health and safety issues that we're seeing with students. So the first is mental health. For students who, whether it was high school or college, spent 2+ years in a virtual setting, it really took a toll on their mental health. I'm sure I'm not saying anything new when defining that, but mental health doesn't just stay here when students travel abroad. It travels with them. And sometimes studying away or studying abroad can exacerbate mental health concerns. So we're seeing a lot of mental health related issues while on site. And that was true before COVID, but it's even more so now. Along with those same lines, we're having some issues with group dynamics with students. They've been virtual for so long. I think some students and even some non-students are having trouble readjusting to being back in person and navigating that space. But we're also seeing students with kind of less resilience and less ability to kind of handle small minor things, which leads to, again, issues with their mental health and challenging the group dynamics when they're with people they don't really know all that well in challenging circumstances or circumstances that are pushing them. And then we're also working through navigating emergencies and what does that look like post-COVID or alongside COVID. a lot of the policies and procedures that we had in place related to emergencies still apply, but you've got that extra layer of what are the COVID policies and laws on top of that, and how do we work around those? So some of the trending health and safety issues we're seeing, not all of them, but just to give you an idea of kind of what we're working with when we're supporting students and programs in the field. I think now we're going to hear from our panelist.
Thank you, Anna. I welcome our panelists to join us back on video. And I will, I prepared some prompts for us to talk about today. And I thought as we discuss it, if you have any anecdotes that you want to share, if you can kind of remove any identifying information so we can share the situation, but that no one can maybe identify who we might be talking about. But first, I wanted to cover how we're preparing our students for each of the individual experiences that you operate. So I was wondering, Emily, if you could kick us off and talk about how you prepare your ACE student athletes for their immersive experiences.
Great, thanks, Catherine. So we, as Amanda mentioned, we work across 2 different universities, so Duke and Stanford athletics to run our programs. And so we really see the preparation for this program starting with application as part of the reflection process, and really ask our participants to be active participants. It sounds a little redundant, but in preparing themselves for these experiences, just like, you know, we use a lot of our student athletes leaning into things that they're doing already and saying, look, you know, how would you prepare for a game? How are you going to prepare for an immersive service experience like this? And so we work with partners across Duke and Stanford in order to both on sort of the back end and the front end for our students. So working with Anna and her team with OJHS and our counterparts at Stanford as well. We work with student health in terms of pre-program travel health preparation. We work thinking about the ethics of service and preparing them for that community engagement piece. And then probably what's most unique for ACE and working with student athletes is we have a whole support team that we work with on the athletic side of preparing our students. So thinking about nutrition and sports performance and how those integrate into what they're going to be doing there on the ground. And then finally, we have our ambassador team. So our alums of the program are really pivotal and part of preparing students for the health and safety aspects as much as the group experience and really the values of ACE. So we do a combination of online and in-person preparation, given that we are spanning 2 different universities. So we like to find ways to bring all of our students together through consistent messaging there. And then we also do in-person preparation here on each campus at Duke and Stanford.
Great, fantastic, thank you. Amy and Susan, I know your programs are a little different because there's an academic component. So in addition to sharing with us how you prepare your students for the experience, could you touch on how you're preparing faculty to lead these experiences?
Sure, Catherine, thank you. I'll jump right in. I have the benefit of actually having my feet in 2 ponds right now. I was the assistant director in GEO for 13 years, and now I've just started in January as program director for Duke Immerse. So I've been fortunate in GEO to work with a lot of faculty to prepare faculty for summer programs, short-term summer programs. So that is allowing me also to transfer these skills to work with my Duke Immerse faculty who are having a semester with students here on campus at Duke, but also incorporating short-term experiential education pieces into their programs. So for instance, they may go away for a week or 2 during the semester within the 4-course setup that is Duke Immerse. So I will be working with them, and this is starting now, certainly, putting their itineraries together, making sure that they've done research on the locations that they're hoping to take students. And again, it could be either in my case, it could be either domestic travel or international travel. So I have to look at those two aspects and make sure I cover things with the faculty, everything from, as we talked about, health and safety, COVID precautions, any sort of transportation issues that they might run into. So I'm taking the best practices that we used for the summer programs in GEO and working with the faculty one-on-one to make sure that their itineraries have been completely vetted, not only by me, but also by OJHS.
And I'll just add, so we do work with established faculty in the global education office for the most part. When we have new faculty, we do offer them additional trainings and support, not only through OJHS, but also with the program manager. They get trained in a variety of different topics. And then they also have a faculty handbook that is online and searchable and accessible anywhere in the world, so that they can refer back to it. So if there's an incident or a problem, say they didn't put the emergency phone number in their cell phone before they left, like all of that is right there at their fingertips. And so we provide the resources in a variety of different platforms so that we can reinforce the message, and we make sure that, you know, you're never planning for an emergency. You're never planning for something to go wrong on site. But when it does, we want faculty to feel really comfortable with the process that they're going to engage with. And if they didn't memorize it during the training or during the one-on-one session, then they can go back to that handbook.
Amy, can you touch base a little bit about the pre-departure orientations that you provide for students and the online training they do?
Absolutely. I mean, our first touch point with students is we have a broad advising network. And so our goal is always that if a student has any concerns, health or safety concerns, or just concerns about their first time traveling, or going on a particular program, what's it going to be like? We engage them before they even apply, offer them lots of resources, the ability to talk to our staff. And then once they've selected a program, we have both an in-person pre-departure orientation. They're different for each program. So sometimes it's 2 hours for one program, and sometimes it's 2 2-hour sessions for another. It kind of varies based on how much like group dynamics and teamwork and stuff they do on the front end. But the key component that comes from GEO goes about an hour, and we go through a standard slide deck that is adjusted to that individual country. So we will talk about specific laws, specific rules that apply to the student. So things you might not think about are like, I used to send students to the United Arab Emirates, and there's a lot of rules about what you can have in your luggage. And so things like what is considered like a lewd image could be just somebody threw a Cosmo magazine in their bag, and that could get taken at the airport and could potentially be incur a fine or even something worse. Things like we're keeping an eye on right now are like watching countries criminalize things like CBD, the availability of marijuana in the United States, and then the criminalization of it. Same is true with prescription drugs. Things like Adderall are controlled substances in other countries. And so we want our students to know those things, because if they're not voluntarily disclosing them, we're bringing them up and we're reminding them that they should be talking to us, because what you don't want is a student to go off their medication or to not know about these things and then show up and get into trouble because they didn't know. And so again, we do that in person in the pre-departure orientation, but then we also have a handbook for each individual program. So again, it's written down and students can go back to it and refer to it. And we keep those updated with all of the current laws and regulations that students should be aware of. And as far as like medications go too, we do ask them to fill out a medical disclosure. So a lot of times they do disclose and we reach out to them. We're proactive in reaching out to them and bringing them in for a conversation so that they can have continuation of care. That's a really important part of something we can do for them is like, let's say somebody depends on their weekly therapy session or depends on their Adderall to be successful. Getting them in to start talking to medical practitioners. We're not the best, I'm not going to solve that problem, but getting them in to talk to that, to their healthcare provider and talking about, is this the best thing to do right now? And then also, if you're going to do it, how are you going to do it safely? And so that's a big part of what we try to get across, and also just kind of how we carry the student through the process.
Thanks, Amy. That was super helpful. My next question has to do with the different health and safety considerations that you're taking into account for your different populations. I know each of your programs run slightly differently. And I have kind of identified ways that they are different, but maybe you could touch on what you're thinking about for your specific group of students when you're planning ahead of time. Susan, I'm going to put you in the hot seat. I know you're relatively new to Immerse, but since your program is doing these shorter group travel, and they're both on campus and off campus, I'm curious how you navigate this.
Right. So I've given some thought to that. And the great benefit we have with Duke Immerse is that you have one cohort of students for the 4 courses in the program, and you have them as a quote unquote captive audience here on campus for the entire semester that they're doing this program together. So for instance, I'm thinking in terms of group dynamics. You have this one group of students, they know each other already, but they're going to be not only in the classroom, but they're going to be experiencing these off-campus, out of classroom experiential aspects, and they're going to be together 24/7, much like some of our students in our summer programs. So I want to make sure that we start even before the program starts in the semester in the fall, to start getting these students used to each other, getting to know each other, making sure they understand how the semester is going to work and what that group dynamic possibly could look like as they're spending time not only in the classrooms, but also on site, where they could be running into any number of different issues as they're traveling. So I want to start that very early, working with the faculty to start talking about those group dynamics. And the other thing I want to make sure is that the students also understand early on what their itineraries are. So they've got their on-campus piece, but they really need to focus on that week or 2 weeks where they're doing something else that is not on campus, where they're taking their classes elsewhere. And these may be students who've never traveled anywhere or have not traveled much, or may have not have done a study abroad program. And so this is a new experience for them. I want to make sure that we're touching base with them before these experiences get started. So I'm a firm believer in early access to the students and talking to them beforehand.
And correct me if I'm wrong, your students will all travel together, right?
That is correct. So yeah, it'll be a group travel short term during the midst of the semester.
And I think about how that is so different from Amy and Emily's experience. Well, I'm not sure about Emily. Maybe you can fill us in about how your students are traveling to and from the site. What are you taking into consideration for that and preparing them?
Sure. So our students do, it is a group-based, team-based program. They do travel separately to the program location, but they do all arrive on the same date and they all depart on the same date, which, talking about health and safety considerations is part of that. So it's a little bit different from other programs maybe like GEO, where students arrange their own booking and travel before and after, or have flexibility to maybe stay longer or stay after. With ACE, it's a fully funded program. And so part of, in designing this program and thinking about it as maybe a first-time international immersive experience for many of our students, about 50%, it is their first international experience. And for most of all of them, it is their first immersive service experience. Many of them have traveled for athletic competitions, but that is very different than traveling, particularly to a lot of the locations where we're running our ACE programs. And so trying to help them kind of understand what are the differences there. And so, we think a lot about, as we're preparing this for this immersive experience, it's not only health and safety for our students, but also for our communities that we're working with as well and partnering with. And I think that's really been important, thinking about, these have been sort of the last programs to restart post-COVID, particularly for that reason, because, and that's even shifted where we've been able to run locations this year just based on kind of where, as we've all sort of emerged from this. And I think, we work with partner providers, which is a little bit different from GEO and Immerse. So all of our programs are run by program providers on the ground. And so, even as they have started to reoperate these programs again and rebuild these partnerships, it's definitely been more on the tail end of kind of the international education community coming back to in-person programming.
Thanks, Emily. I was thinking about your student population specifically, and I think you touched on this earlier, but maybe you could elaborate, because they're student athletes and they're so focused on their nutrition and maybe their training schedules, how you're planning for that when they're in the field. If you could share.
Yeah, absolutely. No, Catherine, I'm glad you kind of brought that piece up again, because I think it is very particular to working with our student athlete community, again, wanting them to have this immersive experience, but also knowing that for them it's really important to maintain a high level of fitness, so that when they're coming back to their teams, some of them are coming back for our fall sports, they only have a couple of weeks till they're coming back on campus after this program. And so sort of that balance of wanting them to be very engaged in this experience, but also knowing that this is an important part for them, our coaches, that's something that they're very encouraging of our student athletes to have this experience, but also, they want our student athletes to come back too, ready to rejoin the teams. And so, one of the things that we think about, for example, you point out nutrition. It's a really interesting piece. We partner with nutrition staff in both athletic departments to look at what's the locally available food. What is that going to look like, and how do we build a plate for our student athletes to ensure that they, have the calories, that they're fueling themselves, because they're also training on the ground too. And so that's, I think, been a really great sort of educational opportunity for all of us to think about, how does that look different maybe for the student athletes, and then what do they need to bring to help sort of supplement that. Same with training. So there is time built into each day for the student athletes to train. The gym facilities look very different than what they might be used to here. And I think that's a great part of the cross-cultural experience for them, is learning how to train in different places, training together. So you have a team of 10 to 12 student athletes from different sports teams across Duke and Stanford. And so they're able to kind of problem solve through that and really support each other through that. But we have to think about safety precautions. So we have cross-country runners that want to run, 120 kilometers a week. And so we need to think about which of the locations that are safe to do that, what precautions do we need to take, making sure that they have, working cell phone with them, that they're, the roads are vetted, that, if we can, that they're running together. And so we work, our risk management looks a little bit different than our other programs because of those reasons. And then finally, thinking about, culturally appropriate exercise, what that looks like in different countries and sort of norms around that, and environmental factors. So for example, in our Vietnam program, it is incredibly hot and humid. And so how do we make sure that, our student athletes are training really hard, that they're also taking care of themselves when they don't have perhaps like their, sports med isn't right there next to them, making sure that they're, taking their electrolytes. And so that we're thinking about that beforehand. And again, working hand in hand across both athletic departments to make sure they have that preparation.
Thanks, Emily. Amy, to close us out, I know you have a very large portfolio and there are lots of nuances between the different site locations, but taking into account that your students have a little bit more freedom in their travel than the Immerse and the ACE students do, what are you, how do you plan for that? How do you prepare health and safety for those students who are all around the world and have a lot more freedom than some of the other experiences we talked about?
Yeah, so the students, for the most part, book their own travel, and on our longer programs, our semester programs, they frequently travel independently over holidays and over the weekends. And so we make sure that students know who to get in touch with if there's an emergency when they're away from their site. I mean, obviously, once they get to site 2, they know who to call in an emergency on their site, at their site 2. But sometimes that's different if they're away from their site. So making sure they know that there's a 24/7 emergency number they can call. We also ask our faculty directors to give us the thumbs up when 100% of our students have arrived. With COVID, it's a little bit staggered sometimes, not as much anymore, but especially last year, we encourage flexible ticketing for students because you might have a planned departure of Monday and maybe you get COVID the Wednesday before, and now you have to delay travel by a couple of days. And so we do still see some of that, or just the airlines are a mess, right? So between those two things, it's probably about 50-50 how many arrive on the day they were supposed to arrive. And then there's always a few trickling in kind of at the end because of either airlines or sickness or something. But we do see more of a staggered arrival now, just post-COVID, or not post-COVID, but post shutdown of our programs. When they're traveling on the weekends, we give them a lot of advice around like best practices, the safest ways to travel. We try to encourage them and try to message really hard that like the cheapest thing is not always the best thing. Like it's sometimes really difficult. I think of an example of like Costa Rica, for example, where you could pay a fee to be at a beach with a lifeguard and have the flags and everything. Or you could go to a free beach that's just like a random beach on the side of the road. It's much safer to pay to go to the beach with the lifeguards. So we're always giving them guidance around best practices with personal travel. It doesn't mean that there aren't lessons learned along the way, but that's what the health and safety response, the 24/7 emergency number, our staff on site are there to help with when those things go wrong.
Amy, do you have any mechanism at GEO for tracking students like personal travel?
Yeah, so we ask students to fill out it's Smart Sheets is what we use, but it's a form. They get a reminder every Wednesday. We figure by Wednesday they probably know where they're going on Friday, maybe sometimes. And so they fill out the form, and both the staff on site and our office can see Like if there's a big group of students headed for, you know, Madrid this weekend, or if there's a big group of students headed
To Oktoberfest.
Oktoberfest, yeah. That's a popular one. So we generally can see the patterns in the travel, like leading into the weekend. And that is helpful for us, but it is kind of on the honor system. And one of the things, like something like that, it's hard because not everybody fills it out. It's hard to get compliance. So you don't always know where everyone is. I think the goal would be one day, like if something happened in a place, like an earthquake, it would be ideal to be able to say, like, these students weren't in town that weekend, like, but because not everybody gives us that information, that can get really tricky. So we end up in those situations confirming the location of everybody if there is some kind of mass scale crisis.
Thanks. So you touched on this a little bit, Amy, but I wanted to open the question to all the panelists about how COVID has kind of impacted your programming. What kind of trends you're seeing with your students? Are you finding you need different supports in different places? Has it altered your programming entirely? Emily, I'm going to pitch it to you because I know some of the answer here, but I want to hear you say it.
Yeah, I mean, so this is the first year that we are coming back to international in-person programming. So we have gone since 2020, offering our virtual programs, which was a whole journey in itself in trying to build those. I mean, one of the things with ACE is that there are just so many administrative pieces that we have to put together in order to run our program. So not only going through all the Duke processes, the extra things thinking about student athletes, but then across another peer institution at Stanford. And so we just knew from the beginning, we were probably going to be the very last to start running international in-person programs again. But through this, you know, and I give all credit to our ACE alumni, our ambassadors, our community partners and partner providers that we work with, in coming together and innovating to figure out how we could create a really engaging virtual experience. And so we have run those the past 3 summers. They were 3-week-long experiences where students were in project teams working with an identified project by an international community partner. And then we built in immersive experiences for them around that. So for example, doing a cooking class, everybody, for example, the South Africa program goes and gets their grocery list, buys their food, and then we all cook together and eat. Last summer, we were able to actually do that in person for those students that were on campus. And so that's been a lot of fun and has actually created an opening for our program to be more accessible to our student athletes. So those students who can't take 3 weeks for many different reasons, who maybe aren't taking summer school, they're able to still participate. So this summer we are still offering that virtual experience. And I think just in general, you know, we've kind of scaffolded our return. So last summer we ran one US-based program as sort of a, let's get our feet wet. Let's you know, we can do this. Let's figure out how to get things going again post as we're re-entering this. And then this summer, we were able to go back to 3 international locations. Previously, we were running 4, but again, trying to like make sure that we are in lockstep with our counterparts at Stanford, with our partner providers as we're restarting these programs again. So we're excited. I think the feedback from the students this year, we have a lot of students, I think, that were kind of sitting on the mark saying, you know, I really want to do this. You know, they've gone through many experiences in their own life where they haven't gotten to do things the past couple of years. And so this return to in-person programming is something I think they very much are very grateful for and don't take for granted. And just in general, just coming off of doing 2 weeks of interviews with our students, we had one student, at least in my experience, who asked about COVID, which I thought was really interesting, given sort of everything that everybody's been through, that only came up one time. And the rest of the questions were sort of your normal, like, you know, concerns about international travel and health and safety. But we're excited to be back and running and having this sort of new option that does provide. We know now if we ever have to move a program out of, in person at the very last minute, we've got a great virtual option, which is something we did not have 4 years ago.
Thanks, Emily. Amy, maybe I can revisit what you had mentioned earlier about COVID and being more flexible with student entry to programs. Beyond that, are you seeing other ways at which COVID has impacted your programming or changed what you're worried about?
It's funny because I think our guesses at like our hypotheses of how this was going to all turn out was much worse than what anything actually ever was. We were prepared for anything and everything, and we had to demonstrate that we were prepared for all of these different outcomes. And we've had faculty get COVID in the field. We've had students get COVID in the field. But for the most part, the mechanism that works on campus is the mechanism that works abroad, or on our domestic programs, which is the student just isolates in their living space, catches up on their work, or joins by Zoom if they can, and everything is fine. Where things get complicated is if the program moves around a lot. And so one of the biggest challenges in planning for the new study abroad world with COVID-19 was when we have programs that go from one location to another and travel, what happens when a student gets COVID at the second location? Like, how do they get back to home base? Or if the program isn't going back to home base, how do they get to where the group is going without maybe necessarily getting on group transportation? Like when we were initially planning for that, it kind of meant that they couldn't be on group transportation. Now it's like, depending on the situation, like maybe the student could mask, sit away from the others, or, be taken to the next location in a taxi or something along those lines. It kind of varies, but what we found is that each situation, if it presents a challenge, like let's say a student lives with roommates and the roommates don't want to stay with a student who has COVID, we just get a hotel. And it does cost more. Like the contingency funds in this COVID world are higher because these programs cost more now because of these contingencies. But that also gives the flexibility to be like, is this okay? If it's not okay, then we can do this other thing. And so knowing what those other things are that you can do is really helpful to pre-identify, because it always like the positive COVID test is always at like 8 p.m. on like a Saturday night. And it's like, you're trying to piece it together, or it's like, it's always at the worst time. I mean, I feel like anybody who's gotten COVID is always like, yeah, it's always at the worst time. And so just having those contingencies ready, working with the faculty on site, working with the provider on site, working with the student to just be like, what is it that you need? And if they do get sick, making sure that, someone can drop food off for them, somebody can help them get medication, somebody can help them get to the doctor, caring for them too, because they are sick. They're not just a leper and we're not just turning them out. It's we're also caring for them as we would if they had strep throat, or if they had RSV or something like that. It's the same care protocol.
Thanks, Amy. Susan, I'll let you have the final word here. I know your populations move a lot as well, so maybe you could talk through some of that thought process.
Sure. Yeah, and one of the things I wanted to mention too, in my previous geo life, one of the programs that I did manage, and I plan to introduce this in immersive, it's not already being done, is that before any sort of trip or excursion or activity, usually the longer trips, you test. If COVID is still a real concern, you want to test the students to make sure that you're not taking students on an excursion that may already be sick. Now, what that means, however, is that, again, you have to have contingencies in place. Let's say you have a student who tests positive 2 days before the excursion to the Galapagos. What do you do? How do you handle that student and work with that student so that there's some academic continuity if the student cannot travel or does not want to travel? And then thinking about sort of the repercussions of that. So it kind of snowballs a little bit when you get into those situations when you're planning for an excursion or an activity as a group, and you have to make sure that you have some other pathways for those students so that they don't necessarily miss out. Obviously, a student not being able to go on an excursion, that's a major part of the program, like with Duke Immerse, is problematic, but you do have to have in mind how you're going to work through that process.
Thanks, Susan. That's all I have prepared for the panelists. I'm gonna have us work through our last couple of slides, and then I will bring us all back for Q&A. I will acknowledge that there are questions in the chat for Q&A, but I think they will be best served for at the end of our presentation. So thanks, guys. I'll have you come back in a minute, and I will bring up Anna's slide. So Anna, do you want to pick us back up?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about what supports from Duke travel with the student beyond campus. So first of all is us, the Office of Global Health and Safety. As was noted, we have a 24/7, 365-day-a-year emergency phone that students have access to the number, and they can call us anytime they have a situation that might be an urgent need or an emergency. So we're here to help them whenever they need that. Duke Reach is also available for students when they're on campus. We actually work with Duke Reach as well as the Student Disability Affairs Office, the Time Away Office, and other student support offices and student affairs prior to departure to make sure all the students have the support they need prior to departure and while abroad. Students also have access to Blue Devil Cares. If you're not familiar with that, it's a telehealth support services app with mental health support, and students can schedule meetings with counselors through the app and have access to that. The one limitation to that is that this app doesn't support outside the United States, but if students have a VPN, and we're going to provide more guidance on how to do that for students in the future. But if they have the VPN that makes it look like they're in the United States, they can still get access to that app. And then students also have limited access to CAPS. It's our counseling office. One of the issues with CAPS is that there's licensing and they're not allowed to counsel students while they're abroad, but we do have access to them to provide some support. And then lastly is ISOS. So this gets at the last question in the chat, but ISOS is an emergency support app or process system to support students while they're abroad. It can help with medical evacuation. It can help find doctors on site, but it also has a travel registry that all Duke students are required to be in when they travel internationally. So it doesn't help us when students are domestically traveling, but with international travel, we can find them in the travel registry and reach out in the event of an emergency in their location. I think I'll turn it back to Amanda.
Yes, I get to sum everything up. I want to thank the panel for sharing their experience and expertise. And the bottom line or primary takeaway is planning hopefully will pave the way for a successful experience for you and students. So the biggest takeaway is to plan to make sure that your faculty and students are aware of the fruit of those plans, which hopefully are protocols and arrangements and resources that will help them through the experience be successful. Make sure they know what to do, who to call, how to react to certain situations. You as a program planner need to think about all of the situations imaginable. This is when you get to visit your dark and gloomy side and really let your imagination run wild as to what could happen. No idea is too silly, but what could happen, just don't get carried away with it. And identify your resources and think about how you might improve that situation. Who would you reach out to? How would you reach out to them? What would you say, etc. And then make sure you have the plans and the resources available in an accessible fashion. So everything we have is internet-based right now, but if you don't have data or you don't have any kind of way to get to those internet resources, it might be good to have a paper copy that you carry around of important phone numbers, or to have printed out a handbook or manual to have in your luggage, or just to even call a friend to make sure that somebody else has a second copy of passports and important numbers and so forth. So yes, I think our final slide will reiterate the fact that the Office of Global Health and Safety is available to the community, and you can contact them for a consultation. So if you have an embedded course travel coming up, or you are thinking of taking students even to Raleigh or to the Marine Lab, they're happy to sit down with you and think through what it is you need to think through to make sure that it's a successful learning experience for all involved.
Thanks, Amanda. I welcome our panelists and Anna back for Q&A. We have a few minutes together still, so if you have questions, feel free. I think Julie said you can unmute if you wanna verbally share them, or if you want to share them in the chat, I can give them to the panelists. I know earlier, while folks are planning their questions, I know earlier we had a question about if you've seen any policies change from COVID, maybe something you wanted to do before the pandemic that the pandemic has made it easier to do. Amanda, jump on it.
And I was thinking about this, particularly in the context of study abroad, study away, and so many of us were already dabbling in Zoom and making overtures into the virtual experience, that perhaps it wasn't new, but the pandemic set things on fire with regards to virtual resources. What we have found, and I think of France, they have great ability to protest, to have strikes. It's constant. And even before the fall, before the pandemic started, was probably one of the worst semesters we had seen in France, with the whole country shutting down numerous weeks in a row. And then what are we going to do with our students? We're supposed to be, all of a sudden a 40-minute commute became a 3-hour commute if they're walking. And even then, would the university be open for them? And what we've seen now is just an easier, more accepted ability to jump online. So twice already, and this is nothing to brag about, it's just, this is what happens when you work in a global setting. Twice already this semester, we've had to take the Duke and France Educo program virtual for a day because of transportation strikes in the city. Instead of that being a huge pain point for the program and for the faculty and for the students, it's just like, you just call it and it happens, and then people do it. And they adapt and move on. And in that regard, I think it's been a plus for just helping us keep on keeping on with whatever is going on, as long as it's sort of short term and doesn't become the experience. So that's just one thing that comes to mind. Not really a policy, but a practice that's been very helpful.
And I would just add very briefly too, a lot of us before we started using Box, Box is a fabulous location to be able to share any type of information, but especially emergency information. You know, you've got your students on programs, you need to have their telephone numbers quickly, you need to have their where they're being housed very quickly, you need to have the names of people that you need to contact in case there's emergency, and Box has made that much easier than, let's say, a shared network drive where you never know how many things are in there that you have to sift through to find the information. So I would say that Box has made our lives in that respect a lot easier and much more efficient in locating information and materials that everybody can get their hands on.
This is kind of an adjacent follow-up question to that. Since you brought up Box, Amy, do you want to talk a little bit about GDPR and Box? How we're using Box at GEO to share data?
Sure, I'm happy to. GDPR entitles all of our students to data privacy protection. And because of that, email is not a secure form to send student information. Like, we shouldn't be sending student lists, we shouldn't be sending medical disclosures, things like that over email to our EU partners. And so anytime we're working with a partner or some of our staff over in the EU, we use Box to securely transmit those files and that information. We also share with those providers and our staff the disclosures that the students have made. And so in the legal disclosure, the students elect to allow us to disclose things about them, and then also allow us to share images of them, which for Catherine is really important as running our social media. So like a student picture that comes in from our Duke in Madrid site looks great, and it's like, oh, you just want to pop it up on the Instagram because it's really exciting and looks fun and makes our program look really exciting and fun. It's not as simple as that anymore because of GDPR. And so you have to make sure that everyone in the picture has agreed, has informed consent about the photo being shared of them publicly. So Box has helped us with that, but we can't use email in those locations to share student information.
Doing that thing where we wait for 10 seconds to see if anyone has a question. Well, for the panelists and folks here today, any final thoughts that we'd like to share? We have about 3 minutes left before 1 o'clock. If not, thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks to the audience for coming out and spending this time together. Again, if you have any questions, you can always reach out to us at experientialed.duke.edu or to Anna directly at OJHS@duke.edu. Thanks again for joining us.